Almost everything Protagoras wrote has been destroyed. Fewer than 10 fragments survive in his own words, most of them single sentences. The rest is reconstruction from hostile witnesses, principally Plato and Aristotle, who had strong philosophical reasons to make him look worse than he was. This creates a problem that is not merely historical, but methodological. We are trying to recover a philosophical system from the testimony of people who believed that system was fundamentally wrong, and they were not careless misreaders. They were brilliant philosophers whose distortions are subtle enough to have shaped every subsequent reading of Protagoras for 24 centuries. The standard approach is to take Plato's presentation at face value and then argue about how charitable to be. But recent scholarship, especially since Bett's 1989 intervention and the 2013 volume edited by Van Ophuijsen, Van Raalte and Storck, has raised a sharper question. What if the categories we use to understand Protagoras, categories like relativism, subjectivism and skepticism, are themselves artifacts of the hostile tradition? What if they tell us more about what Plato needed Protagoras to be than about what Protagoras actually argued? That question will run beneath every part of what follows. We have fragments, testimonia, and 2 extended Platonic portrayals that do not fully agree with each other. The Protagoras gives us a confident democratic educator who defends civic virtue. The Theaetetus gives us an epistemological radical whose views collapse under self-refutation. No reconstruction can harmonize these portraits completely, and honest treatment requires saying where the evidence runs out. What we can do is identify the philosophical problems Protagoras was responding to, trace the logic of his positions as far as the evidence permits, and then assess which criticisms actually land and which depend on interpretive decisions that remain genuinely open. Part 1. The problem of hostile witnesses. There is a methodological asymmetry that governs everything we can say about Protagoras, and it needs to be made explicit before any content is discussed. When a philosopher's own texts survive, we can read their arguments, identify their premises, evaluate their inferences. When only fragments remain, we depend on the people who quoted or paraphrased them. And when those people are opponents, we face a specific epistemic problem. The evidence is filtered through disagreement. Consider what happens in a courtroom when the only testimony about an accused person comes from the prosecution. The prosecution may quote the accused accurately, even verbatim. But the selection of what to quote, the context in which to place it, and the framing that surrounds it can transform the meaning entirely. A sentence that was originally a concession in an argument can be made to look like the argument's thesis. A position that was carefully qualified can be presented without its qualifications. This is not necessarily dishonest. It is what happens when someone with a different framework decides which parts of your thinking are worth preserving. Plato is our primary source for Protagoras, and Plato is exactly this kind of witness. He features Protagoras prominently in 2 dialogues, the Protagoras and the Theaetetus, written perhaps 20 years apart. In the earlier dialogue, Protagoras appears in person as a character, speaks at length, and is treated with a kind of respectful rivalry. In the later dialogue, Protagoras is dead, and his views are discussed, reconstructed, extended, and then refuted in absentia. The 2 portraits are not contradictory in a simple way, but they emphasize strikingly different aspects of his thought. The Protagoras foregrounds his political and educational commitments. The Theaetetus foregrounds his epistemological radicalism. The problem is sharpened by a passage in the Theaetetus, where Socrates attributes to Protagoras a so-called secret doctrine that Protagoras never stated publicly. Socrates claims this doctrine links the measure thesis to Heraclitean flux metaphysics. Nearly every modern commentator acknowledges that this attribution is almost certainly Plato's invention rather than historical reportage. Woodruff, writing in 1999, was direct. We should suppose this is entirely Plato's contribution. But here is the complication. Even if the secret doctrine is Plato's construction, the philosophical argument that Plato builds on it is real. The question of whether Protagoras' position requires a flux metaphysics is a genuine philosophical question regardless of whether Protagoras himself ever raised it. Aristotle compounds the difficulty from a different angle. In Metaphysics Book 4, he treats Protagoras as someone who denied the principle of non-contradiction. He groups Protagoras with Heraclitus and treats both as providing ammunition for a single skeptical position. But Aristotle's purpose in that passage is to defend the principle of non-contradiction, not to give a fair reading of Protagoras. He needs opponents, and he constructs them by drawing together disparate thinkers into a unified target. Whether Protagoras actually denied non-contradiction, or whether his position merely has consequences that Aristotle interprets as denying it, remains an open and contested question. Then there is Sextus Empiricus, writing 6 centuries after Protagoras, who preserves the famous opening sentence of the work called Truth. Sextus calls the work by an alternative title, The Knockdown Arguments, or Katabalontes, a wrestling term for flooring an opponent. He interprets Protagoras through the lens of later skeptical debates that Protagoras could not have anticipated. The categories of Pyrrhonism, dogmatism, and the specific technical vocabulary Sextus employs reshape the material in ways that are difficult to undo. The consequence is this. Any attempt to state what Protagoras believed already involves a layer of interpretive decision. You must choose how much to trust each source, how to weigh discrepancies between them, and how to fill gaps where no evidence exists. These are not peripheral decisions that can be handled in a footnote. They determine whether Protagoras comes out as a radical relativist, a pragmatic pluralist, a democratic theorist, or a proto-phenomenologist. The recent perspectivist reading proposed by Van Berkel in 2013, for instance, reads the measure fragment as claiming that human reference is inescapable in all measurement, a reading far less extreme than traditional relativist interpretations. The textual evidence underdetermines the choice between these readings. What we can do is hold 2 commitments simultaneously. First, take the surviving fragments as primary and treat all later interpretations, including Plato's, as interpretations rather than transparent reports. Second, engage with the philosophical arguments on their merits, even when those arguments may address a Protagoras who is partly a construction of his critics. The historical Protagoras and the philosophical Protagoras are not identical, and the gap between them is itself philosophically significant. Part 2. Man is the measure, but which man and of what? The opening line of Protagoras' major work, The Truth, is preserved in several sources and is among the most discussed sentences in the history of philosophy. In Greek, of all things, the measure is man, of the things that are, that, or how they are, and of things that are not, that, or how they are not. Every word in this sentence has been contested, and the disputes are not pedantic. They determine the entire shape of the philosophy that follows. Start with the word translated as measure, the Greek metron. In ordinary Greek usage, metron refers to a standard of measurement, a criterion by which something is assessed. When a builder uses a ruler to check whether a wall is straight, the ruler is the metron. When a doctor assesses health by checking a patient's pulse against known healthy ranges, those ranges are the metron. The word carries an implication of authority. A metron is the thing you defer to when there is a question about whether something meets a standard. Van Berkel's 2013 analysis of this term argues that Protagoras chose it deliberately for its connotation of practical assessment. The claim is not that man creates reality, but that man is the standard against which reality is evaluated. This is a narrower claim than most readings assume, and it changes the philosophical stakes considerably. Next, the word anthropos, translated as man or human being. Does this mean each individual person or humanity collectively? Plato reads it as the individual, and his wind example in the Theaetetus follows from that reading. If the wind feels cold to you and warm to me, it is cold for you and warm for me. But the Greek anthropos is not inherently individualistic. It can refer to human beings as a kind. On a collective reading, the sentence claims that human judgment, human perception, human standards are the only criteria we have access to for evaluating reality. There is no God's eye view, no non-human metron available to us. This reading would make Protagoras something closer to a Kantian, claiming that all experience is structured by human cognitive capacities, rather than a subjectivist claiming that each person lives in a private world. The textual evidence supports both readings, and this is not accidental. There are reasons to think the ambiguity was deliberate. Protagoras was a professional teacher who specialized in argumentation, and deliberate ambiguity in a thesis statement serves a pedagogical purpose. It forces the audience to work out the implications for themselves, which is precisely what a teacher of argumentative technique would want. A thesis that can be read at multiple levels invites exactly the kind of dialectical engagement Protagoras practiced. Then there is the phrase translated as things, the Greek kremata. This word covers a range that includes physical objects, states of affairs, values, situations, and practical concerns. It is broader than our word things and more active than our word objects. The choice of kremata, rather than a more strictly ontological term like onta, the things that exist, suggests that Protagoras was not primarily making a claim about metaphysics. He was making a claim about the full range of human practical engagement with the world, what we encounter, what we deal with, what matters to us. Finally, there is a grammatical ambiguity in the subordinate clauses that changes the meaning substantially. The Greek word hos can mean either that or how. On the that reading, the sentence says, man is the measure of whether things exist or do not exist. This is an ontological claim. human judgment determines what counts as real. On the how reading, the sentence says, man is the measure of the way things are and the way they are not. This is a weaker, more epistemological claim. Human judgment determines how we characterize and experience what exists, not whether it exists at all. A doctor examining a brain scan does not decide whether the brain exists. But every assessment the doctor makes, whether a shadow indicates a tumour or an artifact, whether a pattern is normal or abnormal, involves applying human standards of judgment to an object that does not interpret itself. The scan means nothing until a trained human reads it against a framework of medical knowledge. If Protagoras is making the how claim rather than the that claim, he is saying something like this: reality does not come pre-labelled, and the criteria by which we sort, classify, and evaluate it are irreducibly human. Both Aristotle and Sextus Empiricus understood the measure thesis as extending beyond perception to all opinions and judgments, including value judgments. On this broader reading, the thesis covers not only questions like whether the wind is cold, but questions like whether an action is just. This is the point where the measure doctrine connects to Protagoras' political thought and his educational practice. If human judgment is the measure even for values, then the relevant question is not what is justice in itself, but what a given community, with its particular history and circumstances, judges to be just. That is a claim with immediate democratic implications, and it links the epistemology to the political theory in a way that most introductory treatments keep separate. But this broader reading also generates the sharpest philosophical tension in Protagoras' position. If every judgment is true for the person who holds it, including judgments about values, then what exactly is the sophist teaching? If my judgment is already correct for me regardless of education, what service does a teacher of practical wisdom provide? This is not a peripheral puzzle. It goes to the coherence of Protagoras' entire professional activity. And it is exactly the tension that Plato exploits in both dialogues, though in different ways. How Protagoras might resolve it will require understanding his distinction between better and worse judgments that are nonetheless both true, a distinction Plato presents in the Theaetetus as the apology of Protagoras. Part 3. The Peritrope and why self-refutation is harder than it looks. The most famous objection to the measure doctrine has a technical name, Peritrope, a Greek term meaning a turning back upon oneself. The image is of a wrestler's own momentum being used to flip him onto the ground. Sextus Empiricus is thought to have coined the term, but the argument itself originates in Plato's Theaetetus and was repeated by Aristotle, Democritus, and virtually every subsequent critic. On the surface, it looks like a decisive refutation. The standard version takes about 30 seconds to state, and most treatments stop there. But the argument has layers that the standard version conceals, and 2.5 millennia of analysis have not produced consensus on whether it actually succeeds. Here is the standard version in its cleanest form. Protagoras claims that all judgments are true for the person who holds them. Most people judge that Protagoras' doctrine is false. By his own principle, their judgment that his doctrine is false must be true for them. So Protagoras is committed to accepting that his own doctrine is false, at least from the perspective of the majority. His thesis destroys itself the moment it is applied to itself. Stated this way, the argument seems airtight, but its force depends entirely on how we handle an ambiguity that the standard version obscures. When most people judge the measure doctrine false, are they judging it false for themselves or false absolutely? This distinction is where the entire debate turns. Protagoras' position includes implicit qualifiers. What is true for someone. If we restore those qualifiers, the Peritrope argument takes a different shape. When Protagoras acknowledges that most people reject his doctrine, he is acknowledging that his doctrine is false for them. But the fact that something is false for you does not make it false for me. Protagoras can consistently maintain that his doctrine is true for him while being false for others, because that is precisely what his doctrine predicts. A theory that says truth is always relative to a judge is not embarrassed by the fact that different judges disagree about it. Plato was aware of this response and built his argument in the Theaetetus specifically to block it. The key passage at 170a through 171c is one that Castagnoli's detailed 2004 analysis showed to be more carefully constructed than many commentators appreciated. Socrates' strategy is to force Protagoras into a situation where the relativizing qualifiers cannot do their usual work. The argument targets not the truth of the measure doctrine in the abstract, but its viability in a dialectical context. The move works like this. Protagoras enters a philosophical discussion and puts forward his thesis. His opponent denies the thesis and holds that it is false, not false for me, but false without qualification. Now, Protagoras faces a dilemma. His own doctrine requires him to accept that his opponent's judgment is true for his opponent. But his opponent's judgment is that Protagoras' thesis is false absolutely, not relatively. If Protagoras grants that his opponent's judgment is genuinely true for the opponent, he is granting that a judgment which denies relativism entirely has standing within his own framework. He cannot add the qualifier for him to his opponent's belief, because his opponent's belief specifically rejects that qualifier. This is the subtle point that Keeling's 2023 analysis in Rhizomata pressed with precision. When Protagoras recognizes what his opponents actually believe, he is recognizing that they hold the measure doctrine to be false in an unqualified sense. He cannot reformulate their belief as merely relative without distorting what they believe. And if he accepts their belief as it actually is, then he has accepted that his thesis is, from a genuine perspective within his system, simply false. The relativizing move that protects him in first-order disagreements about the wind being cold or warm cannot protect him here, because the disagreement is about whether relativizing moves are legitimate at all. Castagnoli's major contribution, developed in his 2010 book on ancient self-refutation, was to show that this entire form of argument is fundamentally dialectical rather than logical in the modern sense. A modern self-refutation argument aims to show that a proposition entails its own negation and therefore must be false. Ancient Peritrope arguments aim to show that a person who holds a certain position cannot coherently defend it in debate. The conclusion is not that the measure doctrine is false, but that anyone who proposes it publicly puts themselves in an indefensible position the moment they try to argue for it. The doctrine might be true, but you could never successfully maintain it in a dialectical exchange. This distinction matters because it determines what the Peritrope actually proves. If it is a logical argument, it refutes the measure doctrine absolutely. If it is a dialectical argument, it shows only that the doctrine is self-undermining as a public philosophical thesis, while leaving open the possibility that it might correctly describe how truth actually works. The differences between a proposition being false and a proposition being unassertable. And that gap between truth and assertability is one that Protagoras himself may have been more comfortable with than his critics assumed. There is a further complication that recent work has identified. Several scholars who accept the dialectical reading of the Peritrope have noted that restoring the qualifiers generates a potential regress. Protagoras says the measure doctrine is true for him. His opponent says it is false absolutely. Protagoras accepts that this judgment is true for his opponent. But then, is Protagoras' acceptance of the opponent's judgment true for Protagoras or true absolutely? Each level of the exchange raises the same question again. Keeling argues this regress does not actually help the Protagorean, because at each level the opponent's judgment remains unqualified, and Protagoras keeps being forced to acknowledge unqualified falsity. Others maintain the regress is genuinely unresolvable, which means neither side can claim a clean victory. After Bernier's seminal 1976 pair of articles, Castagnoli's 2010 monograph, and continuing work through Trabottoni's 2020 reconsideration and Keeling's 2023 paper, the scholarly community still has not reached a shared solution. This is an argument that has been running for 2,400 years and remains genuinely open. Part 4. Plato's Secret Doctrine and the Flux Reading. In the Theaetetus, shortly after linking Protagoras' measure thesis to the proposal that knowledge is perception, Socrates introduces what he calls a secret doctrine. He implies that Protagoras held certain metaphysical views that he taught only to select students, concealing them from the general public. This secret doctrine is a package of claims centered on the Heraclitean idea that everything is in constant flux, combined with the thesis that all being is relative, existing only insofar as it comes to be for someone. Before evaluating whether Protagoras held anything like this, it is worth seeing why Plato thinks the measure doctrine needs metaphysical support in the first place. The measure doctrine says that how things appear to a person is how they are for that person. But this claim, taken alone, is philosophically naked. It says what is the case without explaining why it is the case. If the wind genuinely is cold for you and warm for me, something about the nature of the wind or the nature of reality must make this possible. There must be some metaphysical story about what kind of world would make the measure doctrine true. Plato's proposed answer, attributed to Protagoras, is radical flux. Nothing in the world has a stable nature of its own. The wind is not cold or warm in itself. These properties come into existence only in the encounter between a perceiver and the thing perceived. Perception is not a passive reception of pre-existing qualities, but an active generation of qualities at the point of contact. When your eye meets an object, the encounter generates both the seeing in you and the whiteness in the object simultaneously. Neither the seeing nor the whiteness existed prior to the encounter. Both are born at the moment of interaction and are specific to that particular meeting between that perceiver and that perceived. The philosophical machinery Plato develops for this is elaborate. He posits two kinds of motion: slow motions, which are the persisting powers in perceivers and objects, and fast motions, which are the perceptual events generated when slow motions interact. The slow motions have a kind of dispositional existence, a capacity to generate experiences, but they do not possess the sensible qualities we experience until the interaction occurs. A stone does not have colour until an eye encounters it, and the eye does not have a visual experience until it encounters the stone. Both come into being together, as twins born from the interaction of their parents. This picture has a precise philosophical structure that supports the measure doctrine in a specific way. If properties like cold and warm only come into existence at the moment of perceptual encounter, then there is no fact about what the wind is in itself that could make my perception wrong. The cold for you and the warm for me are both fully real because they are both genuine products of genuine encounters. There is no prior state of the wind, no temperature it has independently against which our differing perceptions could be checked. And this means the measure doctrine is not merely an epistemological claim about the limits of our knowledge, but a metaphysical claim about how reality is constituted. The crucial scholarly question is whether any of this was Protagoras' own view. The evidence strongly suggests it was not, at least not in this developed form. Socrates himself signals the speculative nature of the attribution by calling it a secret doctrine, hinting that there is no public textual evidence for it. Woodruff concluded that this is entirely Plato's contribution, constructed because Plato wanted to understand what kind of metaphysics would be required to make the measure doctrine work. Lee's 2005 study, Epistemology After Protagoras, argued specifically that the measure doctrine neither implies nor is implied by the Flux thesis. They are logically independent positions that Plato chose to bind together for dialectical purposes. Yet the construction is philosophically illuminating, even if it is historically unreliable. By building the most sympathetic metaphysical foundation he can for Protagoras, Plato is doing something unusual. He is steel-manning his opponent before attacking. The question then becomes whether even this steel-manned version can survive criticism. And Plato's answer is that it cannot, because the flux must be total, or it fails to do its job. Here is the destructive argument. If the measure doctrine is to hold universally, the flux cannot be partial. If some things have stable natures while others do not, then the things with stable natures would provide objective standards that could override individual judgments. A fixed fact about the wind's temperature would make one perception right and another wrong. So the Protagorean needs all things to be in every kind of motion all the time, both moving through space and altering in quality continuously. Plato identifies this explicitly in the Theaetetus at 181e. Both alteration and spatial movement must be universal and constant. But total flux of this kind undermines its own expressibility. If everything is changing in every respect at every moment, then you cannot even say that something is white, because by the time you finish speaking, the whiteness has already changed. You cannot even say it flows white, because the flowing itself is changing. Language requires a minimum of stability, at least long enough for a predicate to apply to a subject. If nothing stays anything long enough to be described, then no statement about reality, including the statement that everything is in flux, can be made. The doctrine that is supposed to underwrite the measure thesis ends up destroying the possibility of any thesis at all. This argument has real force, but it raises an unresolved problem about scope. The total flux reading is Plato's construction, built to make the measure doctrine dependent on a metaphysics that self-destructs. A more moderate Protagorean position, one that allows flux in sensible qualities while permitting some stability in other domains, would not fall to this objection. But it would also not fully support the measure doctrine in its universal form. The tension is structural. A metaphysic strong enough to support universal Protagoreanism seems too strong to remain coherent, while a coherent metaphysics seems too weak to support the claim in its full generality. Whether Protagoras himself saw this tension, or whether it is a product of Plato's way of setting up the problem, is something our evidence cannot determine. Part 5. 2 arguments on every matter. Diogenes Laertius preserves a claim attributed to Protagoras that stands apart from the measure doctrine but connects to it in ways that are philosophically loaded. The claim is that on every matter there are 2 logo opposed to each other. The Greek word logos here is doing heavy work. It means simultaneously argument, account, speech, and reason. The claim is not merely that people disagree about things, which would be trivially true. It is that, for any subject whatever, an opposing argument can be constructed that has genuine rational force. The common-sense view is that on most matters one side is right and the other wrong. 2 doctors disagree about a diagnosis. One reads the scan correctly and the other misses the tumour. 2 lawyers argue a case. One has the law on their side and the other is stretching precedent. We assume there is a fact of the matter, and arguments that track it are good, while arguments that do not are bad. On this view, opposition is a symptom of someone's error, not a structural feature of rational inquiry. Protagoras denies this at a deep level. His claim is structural. Opposition belongs to the subject matter itself, not merely to our failure to resolve it. For any pragmata, any situation or concern, the materials exist for constructing genuinely opposed accounts that each have rational purchase on the matter. This is not because reality is incoherent, but because reality is complex enough that different aspects of the same situation support genuinely different evaluations. Consider a concrete case that makes this vivid. A city-state is deciding whether to go to war. One speaker in the assembly argues from the threat posed by an aggressive neighbour, the precedent of past appeasement failing, the current strength of the military. Another speaker argues from the cost in lives, the fragility of the harvest, the possibility of diplomatic resolution. Both arguments draw on real features of the situation. Neither is fabricated or dishonest. The situation itself contains the materials for both cases because the situation has multiple dimensions that do not reduce to a single evaluative axis. The question of whether to go to war is not like the question of whether 2 + 3 = 5. It is a question where the relevant considerations genuinely pull in opposing directions. This principle shaped Protagoras' major lost work, the Antilogiae, or opposing arguments. Sextus Empiricus tells us that the truth containing the measure fragment may have been the opening section of this larger work, which was also called the Katabalontes, the knockdown arguments. The title Antilogiae suggests the work was structured around paired oppositions, a pattern reflected in the anonymous Dissoi Logoi, a text from around 400 that shows strong Protagorean influence. The Dissoi Logoi opens by noting that some say good and bad are two different things, while others say they are the same thing, and then proceeds to argue both sides of this and several other value oppositions. The philosophical question is how the two logoi thesis relates to the measure doctrine. If man is the measure of all things, and if on every matter opposing arguments can be constructed, then the measure doctrine explains why the two logoi thesis holds. Things admit of opposing accounts, because there is no single absolute standard that would settle the matter independently of the perspectives brought to it. The two doctrines are mutually reinforcing. The measure doctrine provides the epistemological ground, and the two logoi thesis provides the practical consequence. But there is an unresolved tension here that standard treatments tend to pass over. Protagoras also reportedly claimed that it is impossible to contradict. This claim, preserved at DK 80A19, seems to follow from the measure doctrine. If what is true for you is true for you, and what is true for me is true for me, then when we disagree, we are not really contradicting each other, but speaking about different things, namely our own distinct experiential worlds. Each person's logos is about their own reality, so the two logoi are never genuinely opposed. They merely seem opposed because we fail to notice they have different subjects. But this sits uncomfortably with the antilogiae thesis. If contradiction is impossible, what does it mean to say there are two logoi opposed to each other on every matter? The word opposed, antikaimenos, implies real conflict, not merely the coexistence of different perspectives that never intersect. Plato and Aristotle both seized on this apparent inconsistency, with Aristotle using it to argue that Protagoras effectively denied the principle of non-contradiction. One resolution is that these doctrines operate at different levels. The impossibility of contradiction is a metaphysical or epistemological thesis about the nature of truth. The two logoi thesis is a practical observation about the structure of deliberation and argument. In the assembly debating whether to go to war, the two speakers are not making metaphysical claims about private experiential worlds. They are constructing arguments addressed to a shared situation, drawing on different features of that situation to support different practical conclusions. The opposition is real at the practical level, even if, at the deepest metaphysical level, each speaker's experience is self-validating. This reading would make Protagoras a pluralist about practical reason, rather than a solipsist about truth. The Stanford Encyclopedia entry on Protagoras notes that Bett's influential 1989 critique questioned whether the category of relativism could contribute to understanding Protagoras at all, and that a pluralist interpretation better accounts for the practical dimension of his teaching. On a pluralist reading, the two logoi thesis is not a pessimistic claim that truth is inaccessible, but an optimistic claim that the complexity of real situations guarantees that multiple rational responses are always available. That is not intellectual nihilism. It is the philosophical foundation for democratic deliberation. Part 6. Orthoepeia and the correctness of words. There is a side of Protagoras' work that most philosophical treatments mention only in passing, but that connects to his central doctrines in a way that is underappreciated. Several ancient sources, including Plato and Aristotle, attest that Protagoras concerned himself with Orthoepeia, the correct use of words. He is credited with being among the first to investigate grammatical gender, verbal mood, and the classification of speech acts. This is usually treated as a curiosity, a footnote about the early history of grammar rather than a piece of philosophy. That treatment misses the point. Start with the grammatical gender work, which Aristotle discusses in the Sophistici Elenchi. Protagoras argued that certain Greek nouns were assigned the wrong gender. The word menes, meaning wrath or frenzy, and the word pelex, meaning helmet, were feminine in standard Greek usage, but Protagoras insisted they should be classified as masculine. His reasoning appears to have drawn on both formal and semantic criteria. These words end in letter patterns typical of masculine nouns, and their reference, wrath and military equipment belong to domains associated with men. This seems like a pedantic linguistic complaint, and Aristophanes mocked it as such. But the underlying philosophical claim is not trivial. Protagoras is asserting that language as conventionally used does not accurately reflect the nature of the things it names. There is a gap between how words are used and how they ought to be used, and this gap can be identified and corrected through rational analysis. The relevant point is that this presupposes a normative standard for language, a notion of correctness that words can fail to meet. Now consider what this means for a philosopher who is supposed to be a radical relativist. If all judgments are true for the person who holds them, on what basis can Protagoras correct anyone's usage of language? If I call menes feminine, and that usage is true for me, what gives Protagoras the authority to say, I am wrong? The very practice of Orthoepeia implies that there are standards of correctness that transcend individual judgment, which appears to contradict the measure doctrine. This tension points toward a reading of Protagoras that is more nuanced than either pure relativism or its denial. The concept that links his linguistic work to his broader philosophy is what the Stanford Encyclopedia identifies as the notion of correctness, which enables the sophist to find the response most suited to a particular situation without claiming a single answer valid in all cases. The correctness of a word is not its correspondence to some Platonic form, but its fitness for a particular communicative purpose within a particular context. Menis should be masculine not because there is an eternal truth about its gender, but because classifying it as masculine better reflects the structure of the language and the nature of what it refers to. The correction improves the fit between language and the world as practically engaged with by its users. Protagoras also classified what Aristotle calls the pithmenes logon, the basic forms or roots of speech. He identified 4 types: prayer, question, answer, and command. Raidmaker's 2013 analysis argues that these correspond roughly to the 4 verbal moods: optative, subjunctive, indicative, and imperative, meaning that Protagoras was formalizing the relationship between the grammatical structure of a sentence and its communicative function. A prayer and a command may refer to the same action, but they accomplish different things in the social world. Protagoras famously criticized Homer for using the imperative, commanding the goddess to sing, when a prayer would have been the correct form for addressing a deity. The connection to his broader philosophy comes into focus when we see what this linguistic work was for. Protagoras taught wealthy Athenians who needed to speak effectively in courts and assemblies. In the Athenian legal system, there were no professional lawyers. Citizens represented themselves. The ability to interpret laws, contracts, and testimony with precision was not an academic skill, but a practical necessity. In the Protagoras dialogue, Plato portrays Protagoras interpreting a poem by Simonides, attending carefully to the relationship between the poet's intent and the literal meanings of words. This is not literary criticism for its own sake. It is training in the close reading of language that would apply directly to interpreting legal documents and cross-examining witnesses. Huytink and Willey's 2021 study in the Cambridge Classical Journal argued that Protagoras' engagement with grammar was more sophisticated than usually assumed, driven not by ad hoc literary policing, but by genuinely formal analysis of morphological patterns. His discovery of grammatical gender as a classifiable feature of language and his attempt to systematize the relationship between mood and speech function represent early moves in what would eventually become linguistics. But they also represent something philosophically distinctive: the claim that language is a human construction, subject to human standards of correctness and improvable through rational criticism. This connects back to the measure doctrine through a shared premise. Language, like truth, is a human product operating by human standards. There is no divine or natural language that our words merely copy. Language is a tool built by and for the species that uses it. But being a human product does not make it immune to criticism. Tools can be well made or poorly made, suited to their purpose or not. And the person who understands the purposes language serves, and who can identify where conventional usage fails those purposes, is performing exactly the kind of work that a teacher of human excellence should perform. The Orthoepeia is not a departure from Protagoras' philosophy. It is the philosophy in action. Part 7. The Great Speech and the Myth of Distribution. In Plato's dialogue named after him, Protagoras delivers what scholars call the Great Speech, a sustained argument for two claims that Socrates has challenged. The first is that political virtue belongs to all citizens, not just specialists. The second is that this virtue can be taught. To defend these claims, Protagoras tells a myth about the creation of mortal creatures, and the myth does philosophical work that a bare argument would not. The standard view in 5th century Athens was that technical expertise belongs to specialists. If you want a ship built, you consult a shipwright. If you want a temple designed, you consult an architect. Socrates pushes this point hard. When technical questions come up in the Athenian assembly, only the relevant experts are heeded, and anyone else who speaks is shouted down. But when the assembly deliberates about justice or policy, any citizen may speak, and no one is dismissed for lacking credentials. This, Socrates argues, shows that the Athenians themselves do not believe political virtue is a form of knowledge, because they do not restrict deliberation about it to those with special training. Protagoras answers with the myth of Prometheus and Epimetheus. When the gods created mortal creatures, they assigned 2 titans to distribute survival capacities among the species. Epimetheus, whose name means afterthought, went first and gave speed to some, strength to others, armor to some, fertility to others. Each species received a package of traits that would allow it to survive within an ecological balance. But Epimetheus was not wise enough for the task and exhausted all the available qualities before reaching humans. The human species was left naked, unshod, unarmed, and unprotected. Prometheus, whose name means forethought, saw the disaster and stole fire and technical wisdom from the workshop of Hephaestus and Athena. These gifts allowed humans to develop the practical arts: shelter, clothing, agriculture, language. But technical skill alone was not enough to save the species. Humans could build tools and grow food, but they could not live together without destroying each other. Every time they gathered into communities for protection against wild animals, they fell into conflict with one another. Technical competence without political competence was a recipe for extinction. Zeus intervened by sending Hermes to distribute two qualities among all humans without exception: eidos, translated variously as shame, modesty or reverence, and dike, justice. The critical detail is in how Zeus orders the distribution. Hermes asks whether these qualities should be distributed like the technical arts, given to specialists only, or to everyone. Zeus commands universal distribution and adds a law. Anyone who cannot partake of shame and justice is to be killed as a disease of the city. The myth is doing several things at once, and separating them matters. First, it explains why the Athenians are right to let every citizen speak on political matters in the assembly. Political virtue is not a specialized techne distributed to the few, but a capacity distributed to all. The shoemaker and the general both possess the basic moral sense that makes political deliberation possible. Second, it establishes a distinction between two kinds of human excellence: technical skill, which is unevenly distributed and requires specialist training, and political virtue, which is universally distributed but still requires cultivation. Third, and most subtly, it provides a naturalistic account of human social development that replaces divine command with functional necessity. Humans need justice not because the gods demand it, but because without it the species cannot survive. The Stanford Encyclopedia notes that several scholars, following Catherine Morgan, have argued the myth is genuinely Protagorean rather than a Platonic invention. Its structure matches what we know of Protagoras' other commitments: a humanistic account of civilization, a democratic conception of political competence, and an implicit rejection of the idea that moral authority comes from divine revelation. But Plato also embeds tensions in the myth that may or may not be intentional on Protagoras' part. If Zeus distributes justice directly, what role does this divine intervention play in the philosophy of a man who professed agnosticism about the gods? If the myth is read literally, it contradicts Protagoras' theological position. If read as a metaphor for natural social development, it works, but then the choice of mythical form over direct argument becomes itself a philosophical question about the relationship between persuasion and demonstration. Part 8. Whether virtue can be taught. The myth establishes that all humans possess a basic capacity for political virtue, but establishing that something exists is not the same as showing it can be taught. Socrates' second challenge cuts deeper. If virtue is teachable, Why do the best Athenian fathers so often fail to produce virtuous sons? Pericles himself, the most powerful and admired man in Athens, could not make his own children competent in political life. If the greatest practitioner of virtue cannot transmit it, the idea that it can be taught looks dubious. Protagoras' response shifts the terms of the debate in a way that most treatments underestimate. He argues that the question is badly framed because it assumes teaching looks like what happens in a craftsman's workshop, where a single expert transmits a specific skill to an apprentice. Political virtue is not taught that way. It is taught by everyone all the time, from the moment a child is born. Parents correct children, nurses admonish them, teachers shape them, laws constrain them, and the entire social environment functions as a continuous education in virtue. The question is not whether there are individual teachers of virtue, but whether one can opt out of the process entirely. To illustrate this, Protagoras introduces a thought experiment with real bite. Take the most wicked person in a society with functioning laws and education, and compare them with someone raised entirely outside any social order. Even the worst citizen of Athens would appear as a model of virtue compared to someone who grew up without any exposure to law, social norms, or communal life. The difference between the two shows that the social process works. It produces virtue. The fact that it produces uneven results is no more a refutation of its existence than the fact that some people are bad at flute playing refutes the existence of flute instruction. This argument has a precise structure that is worth making explicit. Premise 1. Virtue is a function of social formation, not innate character alone. Premise 2. Social formation is a form of teaching, broadly understood. Premise 3. The universal presence of this teaching, rather than its occasional failure, is the relevant evidence. Conclusion. Virtue can be taught, and in fact is being taught constantly. Socrates' examples of good fathers with bad sons do not refute this because those sons still received the universal education. They simply responded to it less well than others, just as some music students learn faster than others under the same instruction. The reason good fathers sometimes produce bad sons is not that virtue is unteachable, but that individual capacity varies. Protagoras uses the analogy of flute playing directly. If everyone in a society were required to learn the flute from childhood, and all received constant instruction, there would still be variation in ability. The sons of the best flute players would not necessarily be the best players themselves, because natural talent and effort also matter. But every person in that society would be a better flute player than anyone from a society where the flute did not exist. The comparison class that matters is not father versus son, but society with moral education versus society without it. This has a consequence for how we understand Protagoras' own professional role. He is not claiming to teach virtue the way a carpenter teaches carpentry. He is claiming to accelerate and refine a process that is already happening. Everyone teaches virtue. Protagoras teaches it better. The distinction between better and worse teaching is where his expertise lies, and it is the same distinction that the apology of Protagoras in the Theaetetus invokes. The sophist does not make false beliefs true, but replaces worse states of judgment with better ones. The question of whether this distinction is coherent, given the measure doctrine, is the tension that carries into the next part. Part 9. Punishment without retribution. Embedded in the Great Speech is a theory of punishment that scholars have identified as one of the earliest explicit rejections of retributive justice in Western thought. Protagoras states the principle with startling directness. No one who punishes rationally does so for the sake of the wrongdoing that has already been committed. To punish someone merely because they did wrong, looking only backward at the offence, is mindless vengeance, the behaviour of a savage brute. Rational punishment looks forward. Its purpose is to prevent the wrongdoer from offending again, and to deter others who witness the punishment from committing similar acts. The common-sense view that Protagoras is rejecting holds that punishment is deserved as a proportional response to the crime. A thief deserves to suffer because he caused suffering. A murderer deserves death because he took a life. This view has deep intuitive appeal and connects punishment to a kind of cosmic balancing. The scales of justice are out of equilibrium after a crime, and punishment restores the balance. Most people, if pressed, would say that a criminal who suffers nothing for his crime has gotten away with something, regardless of whether further crimes are prevented. Protagoras identifies the precise point where this view fails as a principle of rational action. The past is irreversible. No amount of suffering imposed on a thief returns the stolen goods. No execution of a murderer brings the victim back to life. Punishment that aims only at matching suffering to suffering is directed at something that cannot be changed. A rational agent directs action toward outcomes that can be changed, which means toward the future, reducing the likelihood of further offences, reforming the offender's character, and shaping the community's behaviour through the visible consequences of wrongdoing. This position connects directly to the teachability of virtue. If virtue can be taught, then a person who acts badly is not irredeemably wicked, but inadequately educated. Punishment, on this view, is a form of education. It corrects the offender the way a parent corrects a child, not by taking revenge for the misbehaviour, but by creating conditions under which better behaviour becomes more likely. The purpose of the punishment is forward-looking, to produce a person who, having experienced the consequences, will act differently in the future. And the purpose extends beyond the individual offender to the community that observes the punishment and adjusts its own behaviour accordingly. Notice what this theory requires. It requires that people can change, that their future behaviour is not determined by their past character, but can be influenced by experience and instruction. It requires that the community has a legitimate interest in shaping its members' behaviour. And it requires a conception of justice that is social rather than metaphysical. Justice is not a cosmic principle that demands balance, but a practical arrangement that serves the survival and flourishing of the community. All three of these requirements are consistent with the rest of Protagoras' philosophy as we have reconstructed it. Scholars have noted the striking anticipation of positions that would not be developed systematically until Beccaria and Bentham in the 18th century. The consequentialist framework, the rejection of retribution as irrational, the emphasis on deterrence and reform. All of these are present in Protagoras' argument 2 millennia earlier. But there is a tension that the consequentialist parallel brings to the surface. If the measure doctrine holds and each person's judgment is true for them, then the criminal's judgment that his action was acceptable is also true for him. On what basis does the community override the individual's self-assessment and impose punishment? The answer must involve the community's own judgment about what is beneficial, which means that the collective measure, the community as measuring agent, takes precedence over the individual measure in cases of conflict. Whether this amounts to a qualification of the measure doctrine or a contradiction of it remains unresolved in our sources. Part 10. Concerning the Gods and the Limits of Inquiry. The opening of Protagoras' treatise on the gods is preserved almost verbatim and constitutes one of the earliest surviving statements of what we would now call agnosticism. The sentence reads approximately, "Concerning the gods, I am unable to know either that they exist or that they do not exist, or what form they might have, for many things prevent such knowledge, including the obscurity of the subject and the brevity of human life." The default position in 5th century Greece was not atheism, but a practical religiosity that assumed the gods' existence as a background condition of social life. Festivals, sacrifices, oaths, and civic rituals all presupposed that the gods were real and active in human affairs. To deny the gods outright was not merely a philosophical error, but a civic offence, an act of impiety that could result in prosecution. According to some ancient sources, Protagoras was indeed tried for impiety, and his books were burned in the Athenian marketplace, though scholars, including Burnet, have doubted this story as a later fabrication. What makes the fragment philosophically distinctive is not its conclusion, but its reasoning. Protagoras does not say the gods do not exist. He says he cannot determine whether they do. And he identifies two specific obstacles to such determination. The first is the obscurity of the subject, by which he means that the gods, if they exist, are not accessible to the kind of observation and reasoning that works in other domains. The second is the brevity of human life, which means that even if the question could in principle be resolved, a single human lifetime does not provide enough time and evidence to do so. This is a carefully constructed position that differs from both atheism and skepticism in their later technical forms. An atheist asserts that the gods do not exist and claims knowledge of that negative fact. A Pyrrhonian skeptic suspends judgment on all matters, including the gods, as part of a general program of epoche. Protagoras does neither. He identifies a specific domain, theology, where the conditions for knowledge are not met, and he identifies the specific conditions that are lacking. This is domain-specific epistemic humility rather than global skepticism. The connection to the measure doctrine is direct and revealing. If man is the measure of all things, then man's cognitive limitations are also part of the measure. There is no point of access to reality that bypasses human capacities, and human capacities have definite boundaries. With respect to the physical world, the senses and practical judgment provide adequate measures. With respect to the gods, the subject matter exceeds the reach of these instruments. Protagoras is not claiming that the gods are unreal. He is claiming that they fall outside the domain where human measurement has purchase. This reading aligns with what Corradi argued in a 2017 analysis of the On the Gods fragment. The statement is best understood not as a confession of doubt, but as a deliberate demarcation of the boundaries of human inquiry. The opening of a treatise titled On the Gods is not a good place to announce that you have nothing to say about the gods. The fragment is more plausibly read as setting the terms of the inquiry that follows. Given that direct knowledge of the gods is unavailable, what can be said about the role of the gods in human life, the function of religious practice, and the status of theological claims? Unfortunately, the rest of the treatise is lost, so we cannot know how Protagoras answered these questions. But the framing itself does philosophical work by shifting theology from the domain of revelation and tradition to the domain of human reasoning about its own limits. Part 11. Making the weaker argument stronger. According to Aristotle, Protagoras claimed the ability to make the weaker argument the stronger, the Greek phrase being ton heto logon kritopoien. This claim earned him more hostility than any other, because it was read as an admission that he could make injustice appear just and falsehood appear true. Aristophanes caricatured it in The Clouds, where the sophistic education is portrayed as training young men to argue their way out of debts and responsibilities through verbal trickery. The popular reading was straightforward. Protagoras sold the ability to win arguments regardless of the truth. This reading is reasonable on its face and should be presented at full strength before questioning it. If someone teaches you to argue any side of any question with equal skill and charges high fees for doing so, the obvious application is forensic: winning lawsuits, persuading assemblies, defeating opponents in public debate. Athens was an intensely litigious society where the ability to speak well in court was not an academic luxury, but a practical necessity. A person who could make the weaker case prevail could help the wealthy escape justice, could turn public opinion against the innocent, could undermine the integrity of democratic deliberation. Seen this way, the weaker, stronger claim is not philosophy, but a sales pitch for an ethically dangerous product. But the claim has a different meaning if placed within the framework of the two-logo I thesis. If on every matter there are genuinely two opposed arguments, then calling one argument weaker is not a permanent description, but a situational one. The argument that is currently weaker, the one that currently has less support or less apparent plausibility, is weaker because its case has not been properly articulated. Making it stronger means giving it its best formulation, supplying the evidence and reasoning that its proponents have failed to provide. On this reading, the claim is not about making falsehood prevail, but about ensuring that every position gets its most competent representation. Consider a specific situation that makes the distinction concrete. A small landowner in Athens is accused by a wealthy neighbour of encroaching on his property. The wealthy neighbour has influential friends, a reputation for probity, and has already shaped public opinion in his favour. The small landowner's case is the weaker argument, not because it is wrong, but because it lacks effective representation. A teacher who can make the weaker argument stronger can help the landowner articulate his case in a way that gives the jury access to the facts. What looks like making injustice appear just is, from this angle, making justice visible where it was previously obscured by disadvantage. Corrades' 2012 study of Aristotle's testimony on this claim argued that the phrase is best understood in the context of Protagoras' pedagogical program rather than as a theoretical doctrine. Teaching argumentation means teaching people to identify the strongest version of every position, including positions they oppose. A student who can construct the best available case for a position they disagree with has a deeper understanding of the issue than one who can only argue their own side. This is training in dialectical skill, and it requires the ability to make any argument, including the currently weak one, as strong as possible. The ambiguity is real, and there is no evidence that would decisively settle which reading is correct. The hostile reading cannot be dismissed. Protagoras charged enormous fees, his students were predominantly wealthy, and the political applications of his training were obvious. But the generous reading is equally consistent with the evidence, and it connects more naturally to the rest of his philosophical commitments. A thinker who holds that on every matter there are two opposed arguments, and that human judgment is the measure of all things, has a philosophical reason to insist that every argument deserves its strongest formulation. Silencing the weaker argument does not make it go away. It merely ensures that whatever decision is reached was made without full information. Part 12. Moral relativism or something else entirely. The standard classification of Protagoras as a moral relativist has shaped nearly every treatment of his work since antiquity, but recent scholarship has questioned whether the label fits. The question is not merely taxonomic, it determines whether Protagoras is a serious moral thinker or merely someone who dissolved ethics into personal preference. Moral relativism, in its simplest form, holds that moral judgments are true only relative to the individual or culture that makes them. There is no external standard by which one culture's morality can be judged as better or worse than another's. If the Athenians consider democracy just and the Persians consider monarchy just, both are correct, and there is nothing more to say. This is a clean, simple position, and it is the position most people attribute to Protagoras. But there is a passage in the Theaetetus, at 160 Sanctus C, where Plato has the character of Protagoras say something that sits uneasily with this picture. The Apology of Protagoras, as scholars call it, introduces a distinction between true and better that standard relativism cannot accommodate. The sophist, Protagoras says, does not make people's false beliefs true, because on his view there are no false beliefs. Instead, the sophist changes people from a worse condition to a better one. A sick person experiences honey as bitter. A healthy person experiences it as sweet. Neither experience is false, but the healthy person's condition is better, and the doctor's job is to produce the change from one state to the other. Similarly, the sophist produces changes in the souls of individuals and in the policies of cities. When a city adopts laws that lead to flourishing, those laws are better than the ones they replaced, even though both sets of laws were true for the community that held them. The standard of better is not correspondence to an objective moral reality, but practical effectiveness, what actually works for the survival and prosperity of the community in question. This is not relativism in the standard sense, because it introduces a non-relative criterion of evaluation. Some conditions are genuinely better than others, and the expert is someone who can identify and produce better conditions. This is why several scholars, beginning with Bett in 1989 and continuing through Apfel in 2011, have proposed that pluralism, rather than relativism, better captures Protagoras' actual position. On a pluralist reading, reality is genuinely manifold. The same situation has multiple dimensions that support different evaluations. There is no single correct assessment, but neither are all assessments equal. Some assessments are more useful, more effective, more conducive to human flourishing than others, and the person with practical wisdom can identify which ones those are. Van Berkel's perspectivist reading pushes in a similar direction. If the measure fragment says that all measurement necessarily includes reference to the human being, then it is not denying the existence of the measured world, but insisting that our access to it is always from a particular position. Different positions generate different measurements, and no single measurement captures the whole. But this does not mean all measurements are equal. A measurement taken from a position of greater experience, wider knowledge, and more refined judgment is a better measurement, even if it's not the only possible one. The analogy with medical judgment is central to this reading, and may be the most important interpretive key we have. A doctor does not claim that the sick person's experience is false. The honey genuinely tastes bitter to the fevered tongue. But the doctor does claim that health is better than sickness, not merely different. This claim requires a standard of human flourishing that is not itself relative to individual perception. The question is whether Protagoras can consistently hold this standard alongside the measure doctrine. Plato clearly thought he could not, and the tension between the two remains the deepest unresolved problem in Protagorean scholarship. If better is itself relative to the person making the judgment, then the doctor analogy collapses into circularity. If better tracks something objective about human flourishing, then the measure doctrine is not as radical as it initially appeared. Part 13. The Protagorean Inheritance in Contemporary Philosophy. The history of philosophy after Protagoras unfolded largely along the lines his critics drew. Plato responded to the measure doctrine by developing the theory of forms, stable, objective realities that exist independently of human perception and provide the non-relative standards of truth and value that Protagoras denied. Aristotle responded by defending the principle of non-contradiction as the bedrock of rational thought, and by arguing that Protagorean relativism, if taken seriously, makes science impossible. For most of the subsequent tradition, these responses were taken as decisive, and Protagoras was remembered primarily as the person whose errors necessitated better philosophy. But multiple lines of modern philosophy have converged, often unknowingly, on positions that resemble Protagoras more closely than they resemble Plato's. The convergence is worth tracing precisely because it is usually unacknowledged. Kant's critical philosophy begins from the claim that we cannot know things as they are in themselves, but only as they appear to us through the structures of human cognition. The categories of the understanding, space and time as forms of intuition, these are the human metron through which all experience is filtered. Kant would have rejected a direct identification with Protagoras because he insisted these structures are universal and necessary rather than variable across individuals. But the deep structural move is the same, placing human cognitive capacities at the center of epistemology and denying access to a reality that bypasses them. Pragmatism makes the connection more explicit, though James and Dewey rarely cited Protagoras directly. William James's claim that truth is what works, that the truth of a belief consists in its practical consequences for the believer, reprises the Protagorean idea that the measure of things is the human being who engages with them. Dewey's insistence that inquiry is always situated, always proceeding from a particular problematic situation toward a resolution that is judged by its practical adequacy, echoes the Protagorean emphasis on human practical engagement as the standard of evaluation. The pragmatist rejection of the spectator theory of knowledge, the view that the knower passively receives a pre-given reality, is structurally identical to the rejection of a non-human metron. The most precise contemporary parallel is with the position called alethic relativism, the view that truth itself is relative to a framework, context, or perspective. This position has been developed technically in recent decades by philosophers including Crispin Wright and John Macfarlane, and the debates surrounding it recapitulate the Peritrope problem with remarkable fidelity. If truth is relative to a framework, is the claim that truth is relative itself true relative to a framework or true absolutely? Macfarlane's work on assessment sensitivity, where the truth value of a proposition depends on the context from which it is assessed, is essentially a formalization of the Protagorean idea that truth is always truth for someone. And the self-refutation objections that Wright and others have raised against this position are recognizably versions of the Peritrope, updated with the tools of contemporary logic. There is also a line of inheritance through philosophy of science that runs through Kuhn and Feyerabend. Kuhn's claim that scientists working in different paradigms literally see different things when they look at the same data, and that there is no neutral algorithm for choosing between paradigms, has a Protagorean structure. The scientist is the measure of the phenomena, and the paradigm determines what counts as a phenomenon in the first place. Feyerabend's more radical claim that there is no single scientific method and that theoretical anarchism is the most productive approach to science echoes the two logo-I thesis. On every matter, including scientific matters, opposing accounts can be constructed with genuine rational force. But the most pervasive Protagorean inheritance is one that operates below the level of explicit philosophical positions. Every time a contemporary thinker insists that knowledge is situated, that objectivity is a view from nowhere that no actual knower occupies, that claims to universal truth mask particular perspectives, they are working within a framework that Protagoras articulated first. The sociology of knowledge, standpoint epistemology, the emphasis on positionality in contemporary humanities, all of these treat human perspective not as an obstacle to truth, but as its condition. Man is the measure, not because human beings are infallible, but because there is no measurement without a measurer. The unresolved question, which is as live today as it was in 5th century Athens, is whether this insight can be held without collapsing into the incoherence that the Peritrope identifies. Can you maintain that all knowledge is perspectival without claiming that this very claim transcends perspective? Can you insist that better and worse judgments exist without reintroducing the objective standard you have officially denied? These are not questions Protagoras answered. They are questions he made it impossible not to ask. And the fact that they remain unsettled after 24 centuries of sustained philosophical effort is the strongest evidence we have of the depth of his original provocation.